Hello, welcome back to the poker vlog. I'm currently reporting from a Starbucks location in what seems like the middle of the desert, but really it's not. This is probably the last good gas station stop from California to Las Vegas, which is back there somewhere. And as you might have guessed, that is gonna be the location for today's vlog. I am going back to Vegas just for a weekend. A few things to take care of primarily, but also to play some poker at the Wynn, where there's like some huge WPT thing going on throughout the month of December. As you guys know, I'm not particularly interested in tournaments, so I'll just be there for whatever cash games are going on. I'll probably try to jump into like a 20-40 or 25-50 or something along those lines. And that's about all you need to know for now. So time to get some coffee, get back on the road, and hopefully win some money in Las Vegas. Let's go.
All right, guys, here we go, playing some 2040 at the Wynn. Perhaps one of the toughest games in Las Vegas, if not the entire country. Let's see if we can hang in there. In the first hand, I sit down with $30,000, by the way, and there's a raise from the cutoff to $100. I look down at pocket jacks on the button directly on his left and decide it's worth a raise, so I kick it up to 400. But when it gets back around to him, he decides that's not enough, and instead makes it 1,500 to go. A pretty big raise, but we've got a strong hand and position. So I make the call and we go to a flop of 777. Lucky flop, you could say. My opponent continues for a bet of $1,200, and of course with the overpair, pretty strong hand, I make the call. And we see a brick on the turn, it's the 5 of diamonds. Does bring in a backdoor flush draw, but not too relevant considering that any pair is a full house. Unfortunately, at this point, I received a phone call, which interrupted the video, so there's going to be a short lapse where you guys aren't going to see what happened. But take my word for it, my opponent checked, and now we have a question between betting or checking back. And considering he's only got 4,000 left, I think a bet is appropriate. Could also be doing this with bluffs and, of course, strong hands like pocket jacks. Perhaps a little too thin, though. We do have aces and kings sometimes in this situation. But anyway, I jam all in for his 4K. And my opponent snap calls. That looks like bad news. I was hoping to get a crying call from ace-king, maybe ace-queen, smaller pairs like 10s or 9s perhaps, but when he calls this quickly, that's not going to be good news, and sure enough, when the river comes a 5, our jacks are going to go down in flames versus pocket kings. You could call it a cooler, especially as we're both in late position, or you could say that I punted with pocket jacks. I don't really care. Either way, we're stuck a bunch of money and we move to hand number 2 where there's a middle position open to $200 and I am in the $80 straddle with 9-6 of clubs. I make the call and we go heads up to a flop which is above average. I'd say it's 9-9-6, giving me a flopped full house. I check it and now he bets 150. Could go either way between check raising or calling. I think I like raising a little more often, but this time I keep it chill and just call, and we see the queen of diamonds on the turn. I check it again, now my opponent checks back, and we get an interesting river card. It's the ace of hearts. So this card should be a lot better for my opponent, but at the same time, I should have some leads here for a block type of sizing. Maybe not, perhaps checking 100% of all my hands all the time makes sense, but I decide to do something a little fancy and lead for around 10% pot. I throw in 80 bucks, hoping to get a raise from an ace or any sort of strong hand. I could be doing this with a 6 or a middling pocket pair, maybe the occasional queen, all sorts of holdings that are trying to get to a cheap showdown, and I don't think my opponent would want to allow that if he does have something strong. Of course, it turns out all that analysis is dead wrong because he ends up calling, and it turns out he has an ace, so he does not go for the thin value, and of course this time that works out for him as he would have got check raised and lost perhaps some more money to my 9-6. Moving on to the next few hands, which will be representative of what it's like to play these middling to higher stakes in Las Vegas. These games are tough, a lot of tight players, a lot of good players, so most of the hands are not crazy action, such as this one. There's a late position open to 200, Small blind makes it 800, and now it's on me in the straddle with ace 5 offsuit. Now, of course, ace 5 offsuit is a terrible hand, but when you look at this configuration, there's a raise from late position. That could be quite a few hands. And the small blind, I think, is a professional poker player, and those guys usually re-raise from the small blind, even with not so great hands, instead of just calling. I don't know why, it's just something that happens. Well, actually, I do know why, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. Point I'm making is the small blind could have a variety of holdings, and the late position player could also have many different holdings. Sometimes we will be running into strong hands, but for the most part, I think a re-raise with ace 5 offsuit might get the job done. So I make it $1,900 to go. The initial raiser folds, and now it's back on the small blind, who does not seem too thrilled, and that is exactly what I was hoping to accomplish. Even better news is that he lets it go. So we take down a little over $1,000 uncontested. Before moving on, I should say that doing this with ace 5 offsuit is just a complete punt. I do not advise this. For some reason, my spider senses were just tingling, and I decided to go for it. In the next one, middle position opens to 100, cutoff makes it 300, and I am on the button with ace 4 suited. A good candidate to re-raise in a game like this, I think, where players are a little too aggressive pre-flop. I guess you could say I'm trying to fight fire with fire. So I make it $780 on the button. Initial raiser folds, but unlike the previous hand, the guy who re-raised sticks around. So he makes the call for $780, and we're going heads up to a flop in position, which comes down king, jack, 3 with 1 spade. Not much going on for me aside from a backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw. We've also got the overcard, but for the most part, this is just a bricked flop. However, that doesn't really matter because a king out there is pretty good for me as the pre-flop aggressor. So when he checks, I bet $380. As mentioned, I could have all sorts of strong hands like sets, 2-pair, overpair with the aces, stuff like that. And my opponent's going to have a lot of hands that just hate this flop, like small suited aces or pocket 10s, pocket 9s, you get the idea. And it seems like perhaps that's exactly what he's got because he folds fairly quickly. We take this one down without too much resistance. Later on, this hand comes up where I make it $100 from early position with queen 9 of clubs and get called by 2 players on my left. Going 3 ways to a flop, which is great. King 10-5 with 2 clubs. That means I've got a straight draw, a flush draw, and a straight flush draw. Can't say that every day, so I continue with another bet of $100. Both of my opponents make the call, and we get the dream turn card. It's the jack of diamonds. However, we are out of position, and after both of these guys make the call on the flop, it seems very likely that at least one of them will have something good, especially on this turn card like 2-pair, or pair plus straight draw, flush draw, straight draw, all sorts of stuff going on. So I think the play is to continue betting or go for a check raise and try to build this pot. And I guess that's the whole conundrum with having strong hands out of position. Do we want to bet? Do we want to go for the check raise but risk the opponent's checking back? Questions that perhaps mankind will never get the answer to, but this time I check it, and both of these guys sadly check it back. So we're going to a river, which is the 4 of diamonds. Shouldn't change anything. I still have pretty much the nuts, of course, losing to ace queen, but seems extremely unlikely. So yeah, I've got the nuts, but I already checked on the turn, so now leading out for a bet I don't think makes too much sense. So I decide to check it again. Very risky because there is a chance that these guys check back for a second time, but I don't think that's too likely. I think it's more probable that at least one of these guys will bet. Who knows, maybe one of them will bet and the other one will raise. That would be the dream. But we only get half of that formula. The guy on my left bets $700, but then the other player folds. Still no complaints about seeing a $700 bet being placed into the pot. Of course, I am now going to go for the check raise, hoping that my opponent is not bluffing, but when I make it $3,700, an additional $3K, he snap folds. Turns out he probably didn't have much, but still can't complain about making a hand and having my opponent bet $700. Next, I raise it up to 100 with 5-3 of hearts. A little bit wide, but it is Vegas after all. I'm here for fun. The big blind makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop of jack, 4 deuce, rainbow with 1 heart. So we've got an open-ended straight draw to the nuts and the backdoor flush draw in case of emergency. My opponent checks, and I bet $100 with my very pretty 5 high. And then my opponent check raises to 340. easiest call of my life, so I toss in the chips, and we don't see any help on the turn. It's the 7 of spades. Doesn't help my straight draw, and doesn't bring in a flush draw. That said, my opponent slows down and checks it now, and I think a lot of my hands would want to bet at this point, including strong hands and, of course, bluffs like the one I've got here. So I throw in a bet around 30% of the pot, $280. Definitely not giving up on this one if he calls, but turns out we won't need to get there at all because my opponent folds after some thought. So we win this one with 5 high. Excellent result. Moving on to the next one. In this hand, the stand-up game is on. I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with this game at this point, but in case you're not, here are the rules. Essentially, you just got to win a hand before all your opponents do. And if you don't, you owe everyone else a bounty. So the goal of the game is to earn a bounty from somebody instead of being the guy who pays the bounty. So yeah, all that said, the $80 straddle is on, and there's a raise from early position to $300. This $300 raise gets 3 callers, which means there's quite a lot of money in this pot at this point. And now it's on me with King 10 offsuit. Well, I'll be the first to say King 10 offsuit is a pretty trash hand. But there is some dead money in the field, and the player who made it 300 from early position is one of the very few action players at the table, which means he might have all sorts of junk. And even if he doesn't, he only has $3,000 left. I'm always happy to give action to players who I think are giving action to the game. So all that information leads to me making this decision of raising to $5,000. One flag, as they call it here, a flag-looking chip, red, white, and blue. I toss it into the middle, and what do you know? Everyone ends up folding one by one, which means we take down this dead money and, of course, earn our seat back, meaning we will not be losing this stand-up game. A few rounds later, the straddle is on for 80. I believe at this point we've actually switched the game to 20, 40, 80, so it's not necessarily a straddle. It's like a 3-blind game. Anyway, I make it 200 with King, Queen offsuit and get called by the small blind and straddle. 3 ways in position to a great flop. It's King 8-3 rainbow. Pretty dry board on which I've got top pair, great kicker. When it checks to me, I think betting is probably the best play almost always, but occasionally checking back with strong hands I think makes sense. That way we don't get predictable, with betting strong hands, checking bad ones. However, the turn card has me wishing I did bet because it's the Queen of Hearts. We now make top 2 pair and most likely the best hand. Small blind checks again, but interestingly enough, the straddler now leads out for $300. I gotta say, I was a little surprised to see this bet, but of course, not gonna skip a beat. I toss in the 300 and the small blind folds. You could make a case for raising, I suppose, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense after checking back the flop to raise the turn. I feel like that just screams strength. So yeah, I just call. Plus, what if he's bluffing? I don't want to fold out his bluffs. So I toss in the 300 and we see a great river card. It's the 4 of diamonds, which doesn't introduce any straights or flushes out there. And on top of that, the straddle announces some music to my ears by placing a $620 bet into the pot, right around half pot. Of course, I've got top 2 pair, and now it's time to finally spring the trap and raise for value. We're only losing to sets. Pocket kings, pocket queens are unlikely, so unless he's got pocket 8s or pocket 3s, I'm not too concerned with being beat. The question is, how big do we want to raise? And I'm not going to pretend to really know the answer, but I think a big size makes sense since we're representing either a very strong hand or nothing at all. So I make it $2,800 to go. My opponent thinks for quite some time. I'm dreading the all-in that might come if he does have a hand like, say, pocket 8s, but that does not happen. Instead, he just calls, which means most likely I've got the winner. You never know, though. It is Vegas, and these players are quite tight, so I wouldn't be surprised if he just called with, say, pocket 3s or 4s. Turns out that's not what's going on here, though, because I turn over the 2 pair, and it is good. So we are finally winning a decent-sized pot after losing quite a big one to start the session. Things are looking up. Let's see if we can keep that momentum going in this next one, where the straddle is on once more, or rather the 80. I should just stop saying the straddle's on. Like I said, we're playing 20, 40, 80. Middle position opens to 200, and I am next to act once again versus this same player with ace 4 of spades. Gonna re-raise it again. Don't really think calling makes too much sense. Probably want to get this one heads up, and it's a good pre-flop candidate to be aggressive with. My opponent makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop of 9-5-4 with 1 spade. I've got bottom pair and a backdoor flush draw, and this is generally a board on which I'm going to be a little bit stronger than him. So for all those reasons, I continue with a small bet, just like I would with all my hands. $480, and he makes the call. Turn card's the 5 of diamonds, and now when my opponent checks, I think checking back makes the most sense. We've got a pair, which is good enough for showdown, but probably aren't going to get called by worse if we continue betting. So I just check it back, and we see a fun river card. It's the ace of clubs, which gives me top pair. Well, technically 3 pair if that was a hand, but it's not. So I have a counterfeit 2 pair. I don't know. It's kind of a weird river because we definitely improve, of course, but not really sure what we could get value from when my opponent checks it for a third time. If he was floating the flop with an ace high, like say ace jack suited, for example, we're only going to get called by better aces. And if he has a hand like say tens or jacks, he's probably not calling a river bet. So I just play it safe and check it back. Don't want to be getting trapped by pocket nines or ace 5 suited, for example. And that's not what's going on. Instead, my opponent turns over jack 10 of hearts, which is just jack high. Good on him for not deciding to bluff though, as I for sure would have called a river bet. In the next hand, the stand-up game is back on. I raise it up from early position, aka under the gun for you nerds out there. I make it $200 to go, and 3 people make the call. So we're going 4 ways to this flop, which is king jack 4 with 2 spades, 1 heart. Plenty of draws out there, including flushes and straights. So when it checks to me, I decide to bet $400. That said, I think checking also has some merit because you should be checking more in multi-way pots, and it's also not the strongest hand ever. But whatever, I bet $400. I got top pair. It's not rocket science. Small blind makes the call, and we go heads up to a turn, which is the 5 of hearts, bringing in a second flush draw. This time when he checks, we have another decision. Do we want to check back and see what he does on the river, or do we want to bet for value and try to protect our hand? I think both make sense, but this time I decide to bet. My rationale being, it is the stand-up game, so perhaps my opponent will call with a weaker king, maybe even a non-believing jack, since it might look like I'm bluffing and trying to earn my seat in hopes of avoiding the stand-up penalty. So now that we've decided to bet, it's a question of what size, and I think a big bet makes the most sense. This will accomplish many things, but mainly we're going to get value from straight draws and flush draws, and of course any other holding that might call that isn't drawing but we have beat, like king 9 suited, for example, or ace jack. You guys get the idea. So I throw in $1,740. I was trying to calculate the size of the pot, and I missed it by $100. That's life. My opponent thinks for a bit now and makes the call. So suddenly this pot has ballooned up to over $5,000. River comes the 3 of diamonds. Everything bricks out. My opponent checks for a third time. And at this point, I don't see us getting called by worse for a third time. If he's got a draw, of course, it makes no sense to bet. And if he's got a worse hand than king 10, he's probably going to fold anyway. So I just knuckle the table and check it back. Much to my frustration at this point, my opponent turns over king 3 of hearts, which is a rivered 2 pair, good enough to beat my king 10. Brutal hand. Turns out we had him in really bad shape, but that's gambling. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you get unlucky. What else is new? Speaking of getting lucky, let's see if we can do that in this next one with pocket 4s. I'm first to act, and I decide to do something I almost never do. I limp in for $80. I bet you haven't seen that in a while, an under the gun limp on this vlog. I'm probably going to start doing it more. Seems fun. Anyway, the big blind makes it $460 when it gets to him, and I am the only person who calls. That's right, I put in the old limp call with a small pocket pair. Is this one too? Is it 20, 40, 80? Who knows? I can't tell the difference. Doesn't matter because the flop comes down queen, jack, 4. That's right. Our questionable pre-flop plays have been rewarded. We've got bottom set, and on top of that, my opponent continues betting. $400. Being that I limped in pre-flop, I'm almost never going to have very strong hands on a board like this. 2 pair and sets are almost impossible except for my exact hand. So I decide to just call in position, considering that I don't really have too many bluffs on this kind of flop. Turn card's good. It's the 5 of clubs. I just didn't want to see a Broadway card that adds potential sets or straights on the table. He checks now, and I decide to bet $550. Don't want to go too big, since this is the size I'd bet with draws or let's say middling pairs that bet for protection against ace king, for example, or at least that's how I hope it looks to my opponent, who after some thought makes the call. River card comes the Jack of Diamonds. That means I've got a full house, but even better, a bunch of the draws that were possible on the turn have bricked out, like straights or flushes that don't get there. So when he checks, I bet once again, trying to make it look like I'm either betting for value with a queen, maybe going for some thin value with an under pair in hopes that he calls with ace high, or of course trying to steal the pot with a misdraw, which is very likely since I limped in pre-flop and then called on the flop. I toss in 2 yellow chips worth $2,000. My opponent thinks for quite a while and then does the unexpected by announcing a check raise. Very strong play. He makes it $7,600 to go. And considering how strong this is, I definitely don't want to put in another raise. We're probably only getting called by pocket queens or pocket jacks, maybe queen jack when that happens. So I just call right away, and it turns out he's got ace jack. The Dream River card, definitely a cooler, and it's a card that allows us to win my biggest pot of the night so far, just over $18,000, putting us finally into Profitville. And with that, we move to the last interesting hand of this vlog. There's 3 limpers, and I look down at ace jack in the small blind. By the way, it's worth noting that there are 3 limps in this hand. Maybe these guys were inspired by my pocket fours limp earlier on. Probably not. It's just not something you see a lot in tough games, people limping in. I'll shut up now and tell you what happened. I make it $480 from the small blind with ace jack and get called by only the straddler. So we're going to go heads up out of position to a decent flop. It's king, king, 6 with 2 hearts. Usually when higher cards are paired on the flop, it's going to favor the pre-flop raiser. So with that in mind, I bet 380. My opponent makes the call, and we see a decent turn card. It's the Jack of Diamonds. So now there are 2 flush draws out there. And of course, we've got second pair top kicker. I decided to continue betting, but I think checking might have made more sense. I'm going to be honest, I'm not super sure what the best course of action is here. Is it checking or is it betting? My usual rule of thumb is when in doubt, bet it out. So I throw in 750. Doesn't really matter though because my opponent snap folds. So not the most action-packed hand or anything like that, but still noteworthy, I think. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brought an end to my session. Ended up heading out for dinner shortly after. As always, I hope you all enjoyed the hands. And by the way, if you haven't had dinner at Allegro at the Wynn, highly recommend it. It's not their best restaurant that they have on the property, but it's pretty damn good. Anyway, let's go to the outro. All right, so reporting from Monrovia in California. It's been a few days since that trip that you guys saw from Vegas, and it went pretty good. As you guys saw, it wasn't like the most action-packed session ever, but I did end up winning $2,950, which is not bad considering that it's probably one of the toughest games in the country, as mentioned. But yeah, overall, I had a good time. Didn't really play too many big pots, which I think is also indicative of that type of game. A lot of tight players, let's say, but I came out ahead and can't really complain about that. However, it is back to scheduled programming now, which mostly just entails playing at Hustler on live streams and whatever else comes across my plate. So that's it for now, guys. As always, thank you for the support. If you liked or commented or did any of the YouTube things, I appreciate it. And until next time, good luck at your local tables. Peace.